You never really know someone until they frame you for a crime that shatters your life. At 16, I learned that the most dangerous enemy could sleep in the room next door. My family always seemed perfect on the outside. My dad, Marcus, worked hard, my mom, Diana, smiled through everything, and my older brother, Jax, was golden, charming, clever, everyone's favorite. I thought I knew them, but I couldn't have been more wrong. It all started one evening when Dad discovered $10,000 missing from his home safe. I was in my room, oblivious, until Jax calmly handed over a fake text message and a bracelet he had stolen from me. He presented them as evidence, claiming I had taken the money and hidden a secret life he painted as dangerous and reckless. Mom immediately believed him, her voice sharp as she called me ungrateful and dishonest. Even Dad, hesitant at first, seemed convinced by the proof that I was guilty. I tried to explain, to show him I hadn't touched a dime, but my words bounced off walls that were suddenly stacked against me. The betrayal was suffocating. The brother I had trusted, the parents I had adored, they all sided with him. The house that had once felt safe became a trap. Their judgment was final. I was no longer their daughter. I was a problem to fix. My desperate pleas, my tears, my insistence on my innocence, all meant nothing. They made a decision that would feel like a life sentence. I was sent away to a strict, isolated behavioral boarding school hundreds of miles from home. The night I left, I packed my small bag quietly, trying not to cry in front of them, trying to pretend I was calm. But inside, a storm raged. How could someone I grew up with, someone I trusted with my secrets, turn on me so completely? The house I had loved felt like a cage I could never return to. Every goodbye was a dagger. Every step toward the car felt heavier than the last. I realized then that my life had been split into before and after, and the world I knew was gone. As the school bus carried me further away, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't break. They had tried to erase me, but I would survive. I would endure, learn, and grow stronger. One day, I would prove that the truth always finds its way out, and the people who betrayed me would understand that their actions had consequences. But for now, I was alone, angry, and determined, not broken. Being sent away was only the start of a long, lonely battle. For 2 years, I wasn't seen as a daughter or a sister. At the boarding school, I was just another file, another problem they needed to fix. Every day was a struggle. The rules were strict, the routines endless, and the counselors seemed determined to strip away every bit of independence I had left. Isolation became my constant companion. I spent hours in my small, plain room, staring at the walls, counting the minutes until the next forced activity or lecture. Communication with my family was rare and hollow. When Dad called, it was under strict supervision. His voice sounded tired, distant, like he carried the weight of something he couldn't quite admit. He never asked the right questions, never seemed to fight for me. I realized my mother had told everyone I was in a special therapeutic program, making it sound like I had problems that didn't exist. My friends at school asked why I was here, and I learned to keep my mouth shut. I couldn't risk anyone knowing the truth. The world I had known was replaced by rules, lies, and silence. In the quiet hours, I began to think. If everyone was convinced I was a criminal, then maybe I could use that to my advantage. I started reading everything I could find in the small library, books about psychology, human behavior, manipulation, and strategy. I learned how people could be influenced, how lies could be uncovered, and how evidence could be hidden or revealed. The more I read, the more I realized that knowledge was power. I wouldn't just survive this, I would prepare. Every lesson in control, every moment of isolation, became a stepping stone. I memorized patterns, observed weaknesses in the staff and rules, and practiced thinking 2 steps ahead. I knew my family had made a mistake, but proving it would take patience and precision. Anger fueled me, but careful planning became my weapon. I imagined the day I would return home, not broken and defeated, but strong and prepared to confront the lies that had been built around me. The boarding school may have tried to erase my identity, but it gave me a secret advantage. I had time to learn, to sharpen my mind, and to see the truth more clearly than I ever could before. While the others followed rules blindly, I studied patterns and weaknesses, learning how to turn a situation to my favor without anyone noticing. By the end of those 2 years, I had grown in ways I never expected. I wasn't just the girl they accused of theft. I was someone who understood people, strategy, and the value of patience. My plan wasn't just to prove my innocence. It was to make sure the truth couldn't be ignored. I vowed silently that the next time I faced my family, it would be on my terms. I would expose the lies, reveal the guilt, and regain the life that had been stolen from me. The seed of revenge had been planted, and I had nurtured it in silence. I came home at 18 with nothing but the clothes on my back and a fire that had been frozen for 2 years. They expected a scared, broken girl, someone they could control easily. What they didn't know was that I had changed. I wasn't the same naive teenager who had begged for their trust. I had learned, I had watched, and I had planned. Walking through the front door felt strange. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. Jax was everywhere, smiling for cameras, praised by neighbors, a model student and son. Mom gave me a polite nod, talking about how proud she was of the changes I had supposedly made, but her words had no warmth. Dad moved slowly through the rooms, quiet and distracted, carrying a weight I didn't fully understand yet. And the missing $10,000? Not a single word. It hung in the air like an invisible ghost, reminding me that the truth had been buried, but not forgotten. I knew I had to be careful. Acting too strong too soon would alert them. I decided to play the role of the quiet, obedient daughter who had returned to make peace. I got a small, unimportant job in town, saving every penny I could while watching their routines, their patterns, and their weaknesses. Every interaction became part of my research. Every slip, every careless word I memorized. Slowly, I started accessing the family computer when I was home alone, studying files, emails, and old documents. I found hints of accounts, receipts, and patterns that might hold the key to the truth. I didn't rush. I couldn't afford mistakes. Every move was calculated, every step measured. My goal wasn't just to prove I hadn't stolen the money. It was to expose the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal that had been hidden for years. I watched Jax carefully, noticing how he boasted around neighbors, how he subtly tried to control conversations with Dad, how he believed his golden boy image was untouchable. Mom, meanwhile, continued her act of polite approval, never questioning him, never questioning the story she had accepted. And Dad, well, he had begun to retreat into himself, a shadow of the father I remembered, torn between love, guilt, and disbelief. I realized that rushing confrontation would ruin everything. The plan had to unfold slowly. I kept my anger quiet, my smiles measured, and my questions hidden. The real work was behind the scenes, building evidence, understanding behaviors, and waiting for the perfect moment. I was no longer the girl they thought they had destroyed. I was a ghost, moving silently through a house full of secrets, preparing to reclaim what was mine. By the time anyone realized what I was capable of, it would be too late. I wasn't just back. I had returned stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. And this time, I would be the one in control. Revenge isn't about yelling or causing scenes. It's about patience, observation, and finding the single weakness that can undo everything. I learned that early as I quietly moved through the house, pretending to be harmless, unnoticed. One afternoon, home alone, I opened my father's old briefcase, a place I had never dared to explore before. Inside, I found a folder that made my heart race, a hidden collection of bank statements my father had never shared with anyone. The more I studied them, the clearer the pattern became. Small, untraceable withdrawals had been happening for months before the big $10,000 went missing. The amounts were tiny at first, easy to overlook, but the timing and frequency matched the lifestyle Jax had been living. Every late-night purchase, every expensive gadget, every unaccounted-for item lined up perfectly with these withdrawals. My brother's greed and carelessness had left a trail, and the family had blamed me for it all. I kept digging, methodically scanning through the files, comparing dates and amounts. Then I stumbled on something else, a crumpled receipt from a pawn shop tucked between the papers. It was for a high-end watch, one I remembered Jax admiring countless times, the one he had whispered about wanting for his birthday. The receipt was dated just days after the $10,000 disappeared, leaving no doubt in my mind that he had used the stolen money to get it. This was the first piece of proof I could hold in my hands, tangible and undeniable. I didn't rush to confront anyone. Confrontation without preparation would ruin everything I had worked for. Instead, I quietly made copies of the statements and the receipt, hiding the originals back in their place. Every step I took was measured. My resolve hardened as I realized how easily the truth had been buried, how effortlessly Jax had manipulated everyone. But now the power had shifted. I wasn't the powerless girl anymore. I was the one holding the evidence. Sitting in my room later that night, I spread the copies on my desk and stared at them. The pieces were starting to fit together like a puzzle, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt a surge of control. 2 years of lies, 2 years of exile, 2 years of being doubted and silenced. All of it had led to this moment. I knew exactly what I had to do next. This discovery was more than proof of my innocence. It was the first real step toward reclaiming my life. The house that had once felt like a prison now seemed like a chessboard, and I had just found the first key move. Every calculation, every hidden detail, every careful observation had brought me to this point. The foundation of their lies had a crack, and once I started pulling at it, nothing would ever be the same. To catch a liar, you have to think like one. I knew my brother's biggest weakness was his ego, his belief that he was untouchable, cleverer than everyone else. I decided to use that against him. Every action I took was quiet, deliberate, and aimed at nudging him toward a mistake he couldn't resist making. I started by planting small ideas, subtle hints that would spark his curiosity and greed. I confided in him about a supposed inheritance from a distant relative, a modest sum he could easily imagine as real. I made it sound casual, almost careless, as if it were no big deal. The moment I mentioned it, I saw his eyes flicker, his posture shift. He wanted that money immediately, but he couldn't ask directly. That hesitation and anxiety were exactly what I needed. Over the next few days, I watched him closely. Every glance he threw my way, every whispered conversation I overheard, every attempt to probe for details confirmed what I already suspected. His greed was clouding his judgment. He became restless, careless, and increasingly desperate to find a way to access something he thought was just within reach. I let him take the bait, keeping my own excitement hidden, my expression calm, unassuming. Then came the moment to trap him. I placed a small voice recorder on the home landline, leaving it hidden where he couldn't notice it. Using a disguised voice from a payphone, I called him, pretending to be a bank investigator following up on old account activity tied to the missing $10,000. I made the questions seem routine, professional, and urgent enough to throw him off balance without alarming him completely. He answered quickly, nervously. His words spilled out in fragments, hurried and panicked, each one revealing more than he intended. He admitted details about the money, purchases, and transactions that matched the evidence I had gathered. He didn't realize he was confessing to the one person who had been wronged all along. Before he could stop himself, before he could think of a story to cover his tracks, he hung up, leaving a record that would speak louder than anything I could say. I stayed quiet, letting the evidence settle in my hands. There was no need for confrontation yet. He had revealed everything himself, proof of the lies and theft that had haunted me for years. Watching him flustered, unprepared, and cornered by his own words was a mix of relief and satisfaction I had never felt before. It was clear now. Manipulation could be used as a weapon and knowledge as armor. By understanding his mind, his patterns, and his weaknesses, I had turned the tables completely. He had thought he was clever, untouchable, and in control. The reality was that his own arrogance had trapped him, and I held the evidence to change everything. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. I was no longer the powerless girl he had framed. I was the one pulling the strings. I had the evidence, but evidence alone wasn't enough. Facts need the right audience, someone who could understand the weight of the truth. I knew my father had to see it himself. He had spent 2 years doubting me, letting lies overshadow reality. Hearing it from me wasn't enough. I needed him to witness the proof, to feel the betrayal as clearly as I had. I waited for a quiet moment when he was alone in his study. Carefully, I laid out the copies of the bank statements and the pawn shop receipt. His eyes scanned the papers, initially confused, then narrowing as comprehension began to take hold. I stayed calm, letting him process each detail, refusing to interject. Then, I played the recorded phone call. His reaction was immediate. The slow rise of disbelief turned into shock, then horror, as he realized the truth. The dam of his guilt broke, and the weight he had been carrying for years finally showed on his face. For the first time, Dad looked at me not as the accused, but as the one who had been right all along. His hands trembled slightly as he set the papers down, unable to fully grasp how he had been misled for so long. 2 years of denial, 2 years of defending the wrong son, all crumbled in an instant. I watched silently, knowing that revenge wasn't about anger. It was about clarity and justice. He needed this realization to understand the depth of what had happened, and he was finally beginning to. Once he had absorbed the truth, he confronted Mom. The tension in the house became unbearable, thick with the weight of secrets no longer hidden. What followed was a shocking revelation. Diana admitted that she had suspected Jax from the beginning. She had known, but chose to cover for him to protect the family's reputation. Every word cut deeper than I could imagine. It wasn't just Jax's betrayal. It was a betrayal from the one person who was supposed to protect and stand by her family. Dad's face went pale. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, realizing the complicity that had allowed her favorite child to ruin the life of the child she had supposedly loved equally. The realization shook him to his core. The house felt smaller, suffocating, as years of deception and lies finally came to light. I remained quiet, letting them confront the consequences of their choices. In that moment, I understood that the truth could be both devastating and liberating. I had taken control of the story that had been twisted against me, and my father finally had no choice but to see what had really happened. It wasn't just about proving my innocence anymore. It was about forcing those who had deceived to face the reality they had tried to bury. The tide had turned, and I was no longer powerless. With my father finally understanding the truth, everything shifted. The game was no longer just about proving I hadn't stolen the money. It was about making sure those who lied faced real consequences. For years, Jax had hidden behind charm and manipulation, while Mom and Dad ignored or rationalized his behavior. Now the balance had tipped. Dad confronted Jax first. He laid out the evidence, showing him the bank statements, the pawn receipt, and the recording. Jax tried to deflect at first, but Dad's voice was steady, unyielding. He gave him an ultimatum, a full, written confession admitting the theft, along with repayment of every cent he had taken, including interest or face criminal charges. For the first time, Jax looked unsure, the confident mask slipping. The golden boy was cornered, his options shrinking with every second. Mom was next. Dad told her the truth had to be recognized, that her role in protecting Jax could no longer be ignored. She had to choose between supporting honesty or losing everything she had built. The shock on her face was immediate. She had spent years protecting appearances, but now those appearances couldn't save her. The reality of her complicity hit hard, and she realized that she could no longer escape responsibility. Jax eventually gave in. He wrote the confession, each word a bitter acknowledgement of what he had done. Watching him struggle with the admission was satisfying, but it wasn't about cruelty. It was about justice. The act of finally naming his lies brought a sense of closure, a confirmation that truth could not be avoided forever. He repaid the money as promised, a symbolic act of accountability that marked the first time he had to face real consequences. Mom's reaction was a mixture of shock and shame. She admitted she had known more than she should have and tried to explain her actions, but words could not undo the years of enabling. The confrontation left her speechless, realizing that protecting appearances had only caused pain. Once the confessions and repayments were completed, Dad turned to me. After years of being doubted, ignored, and cast aside, he asked what I wanted to do next. For the first time, the power of judgment rested entirely in my hands. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the one in control. The years of planning, patience, and observation had led to this moment. The house that once felt like a prison was now a place where truth reigned, and I could decide how to move forward. For me, it wasn't about revenge in the cruel sense. It was about setting things right and ensuring that lies could no longer dominate my life. The consequences had been delivered, and the power had shifted. Jax had lost his untouchable image, Mom had faced her betrayal, and Dad now saw the reality clearly. I finally had the chance to reclaim my place, not as the accused, but as someone who had endured, learned, and triumphed. The house of cards they had built on lies had collapsed, and I stood steady in the wreckage, ready to shape what came next. Forgiveness is for those who deserve it. I wasn't looking to be merciful. I wanted justice, and my kind of justice meant reclaiming my life while making sure the people who betrayed me understood the weight of their actions. The signed confession and the money Jax repaid became tools for rebuilding what had been taken from me. I used them to secure my first apartment and cover my college tuition, creating independence on my own terms. Every dollar reminded me that the power had shifted, that I was no longer the powerless girl they had tried to erase. I didn't want Jax in prison. Punishment wasn't my goal. What mattered was that he faced real consequences and learned to live with responsibility. I set strict conditions for him. Therapy to address his actions, a legitimate job to support himself, and oversight from Dad to ensure he couldn't manipulate his way back into privilege. I watched as he realized that charm and excuses no longer worked. He had to confront the reality he had ignored for so long, and that truth alone carried its own weight. Mom, however, was a different story. Her betrayal ran too deep. Years of enabling Jax and dismissing me could not be undone with apologies or words. I told her plainly that our relationship was over. Some wounds don't heal, and some trust cannot be restored. Cutting ties was painful, but necessary. It was a line drawn in the sand, a boundary I needed to protect myself from further harm. I refused to let her actions continue to shadow my life, and I finally accepted that distance was the only way forward. With Dad, the situation was more complicated. He had been misled, but he had also tried, in his way, to understand the truth once he saw it clearly. I allowed a cautious, honest relationship to grow between us. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I could see remorse in his eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt a connection that wasn't clouded by lies or manipulation. Together, we began rebuilding trust slowly and carefully, with honesty as the foundation. In this new chapter, I became the architect of my own future. I didn't need to destroy anyone to feel vindicated. I only needed to ensure that the lessons were learned and that my life could move forward unshaken. The chaos and betrayal of the past became the framework for my strength, shaping the person I had grown into. I had reclaimed control, carved out independence, and set clear boundaries. The past could not touch me anymore, and the people who had tried to ruin me were now accountable for their actions. Justice had been served, not through revenge alone, but through the careful, deliberate rebuilding of a life no one could take from me. I was free, strong, and finally in control of my story. I thought my revenge was finished. I had exposed the lies, regained control, and set the rules for Jax. But life had a way of showing me that consequences often go further than planned. What I had set in motion rippled outward in ways I couldn't have predicted, and the fallout reached beyond the walls of our home. Jax couldn't cope with the humiliation. For years, he had been the golden boy, praised for charm and talent, protected from mistakes by his family's favoritism. Suddenly, that image crumbled. Friends who once envied him turned away, colleagues who admired him questioned his integrity, and neighbors whispered about the scandal. The pressure mounted until he couldn't hide it anymore. One day, in front of coworkers, he had a complete breakdown, yelling, blaming, and trying to justify actions that everyone already knew were wrong. His privileged world collapsed, and he lost his job, his reputation, and most of the people who had pretended to support him. I didn't have to lift a finger. His own choices had orchestrated the ruin, amplified by the truth I had revealed. Meanwhile, my mother's carefully maintained social image was shattered. She had spent years protecting Jax and covering for his misdeeds, presenting herself as the perfect mother and upstanding member of the community. When the truth came out, the cracks in that image widened quickly. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, and whispers of her complicity circulated. She attempted to apologize, but it felt hollow, a self-pitying attempt to regain sympathy rather than acknowledge the real harm she caused. Her words didn't carry sincerity, only regret that her social standing had been affected. I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that closure doesn't always come from reconciliation or acceptance. Sometimes it comes from stepping back, letting others face the consequences of their actions, and choosing not to let their mistakes affect your peace. Watching them struggle under the weight of what they had caused gave me a sense of finality. I realized that the damage done by lies and manipulation often circles back in ways the liar cannot control. For me, this was the final confirmation that I had acted wisely. I had restored my life, built independence, and created boundaries that no one could cross. The social and personal collapse of Jax and the isolation of Mom were consequences I hadn't needed to enforce. They were natural results of truth coming to light. In that moment, I understood that revenge isn't always about doing something yourself. Sometimes it's about revealing the truth, standing firm, and letting the world respond to reality. I felt no satisfaction in cruelty, only in the recognition that justice, in its own way, had been served. I had reclaimed my life completely, and the universe had taken care of the rest. Indifference, not anger, became my final triumph. They took 2 years of my life and tried to erase me, but I refused to stay buried. I rebuilt myself from the ground up, stronger, wiser, and completely on my own terms. Every step I took, every choice I made, was about reclaiming what they had tried to steal: my confidence, my independence, and my sense of self. Years later, I've created a life I can be proud of. I earned my degree, worked hard, and established a career that is entirely mine. The freedom of supporting myself, making my own decisions, and shaping my future without interference has been the greatest reward. I finally feel grounded, in control, and unshakable. My relationship with Dad has slowly mended. He had to earn back even a fraction of my trust, but over time, we found a way to be honest with each other. We rebuilt a cautious, genuine connection, one that is based on understanding and truth rather than blind faith. It is not perfect, but it is real, and that is enough. As for Jax and Mom, I never saw them again. I realized that some people are not meant to be in your life, no matter the past. My focus was never revenge for its own sake. It was about reclaiming my power and my future. Watching them face the consequences of their choices was enough. They learned the hard way that lies and betrayal eventually catch up. The most important victory was mine. I did not let bitterness control me, and I did not allow their actions to define who I became. My life now reflects my resilience, my determination, and my ability to rise above the cruelty and manipulation I endured. Looking back, I see clearly that the greatest revenge isn't in their downfall. It's in your own success. I am living proof that survival, courage, and self-belief can turn a broken beginning into a triumphant story. They tried to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. I grew. I thrived. I became unstoppable. My future, my peace, and my happiness are my own, and no one can take that away. Do you think I did the right thing by cutting ties with my mom and keeping distance from my brother? Or should I have forgiven them? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this.